Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is NycosRPG. Hey, we are talking about non-player characters, and we are talking about how to create the ones that players absolutely adore, or arguably maybe really, really hate. We're going to be talking about this for some time, so I wanted to give you kind of a framework or a starting point by providing you an example of one of my most endeared NPCs in the story that I tell. And this is Angus Hereford. Now, he is, of course, ironically, with the name like Angus Hereford. You're not really sure what breed of cow or bovine he might be, but as a Minotaur, a Tarmakian in my world, he is an archetype that is not only a framework for other such Minotaurs within the culture here, but he's also one of the most devious weapons traders and gun runners in the entire world, which is funny because, of course, it's a fantasy setting, so the very idea of guns has to be relatively either brand new or innovative or silly. In this case, he invented the pop gun, which is basically a cork-powered magical weapon. But we'll get into that in a much later episode. Right now, we're just talking about how do you create an unforgettable NPC. And I don't think once you have this image in your mind of a John Chisholm dressed Minotaur with corks on the ends of his horns so he doesn't tear the wallpaper because Lady Lila don't like it when I do that. So I have to protect my property by wearing these things on my horns. Anyway, we're going to talk today about how to build a character in the similar vein to perhaps Angus here, as well as to talk about what NPCs really are and what their purpose within a game session really could be. So, having said that, let's get on our way, shall we? So, the first question to ask is, why do NPCs matter? If you've watched any videos in the last, 4 years, the concept of an NPC has joined the common psyche, I guess, of the world in terms of somebody who is vanilla, bland, only merely because they breathe or they are alive. They are not anything of any value to anyone. So the question, of course, becomes, from a game master standpoint, why include them all at all? Why do the NPCs matter to a story? Well, there's several reasons why you essentially want to have them. One of which is you need backdrops. If you are playing as in an urban setting, you have to have people milling about. The idea at the beginning or in the Matrix scene where they're walking through the hundreds and hundreds of bodies in the Matrix in order to test the idea of the optics of a woman in a red dress. This is an example of you have to have some form of backdrop of population for it to be a city. Otherwise, it's not really a city, right? If there aren't any people in it. The next thing is that the NPCs need they tend to have differing views. That doesn't mean they're always disagreeable, but often they don't hold the same position that the PCs might and may be fearful indeed of what the EPCs might do. And so by having these differing opinions, hey, there's Dig. How's it going? Welcome. Where's my bell? Glad to have you with us. We are talking today about non-player characters. So, in addition to providing a backdrop and giving differing views, we also want to talk about the very dynamics of RPG. And the reason why we need NPCs is to provide the backdrop or the methodology for such activity to occur. So, got a plan B going on here in the background. I got to fix that. All right. And then finally, the last thing is we need to give support to the story. If the players have no one to celebrate with when they've won the great victory, why have them go back to town at all? Why is there a town? When we are talking about role playing, we have to have some backdrop or some leverage upon which we can build this element of play. Otherwise, it's academic, and we're really just dealing with the numbers. So let's look at that. Our next point is this. Most players, most game masters in the world, in fact, need to really consider changing their paradigm about NPCs. The concept of the two-dimensionality and the flat nature of NPCs really stems from the advancement of role-playing into the online and the computer game world because of processing power. Early video games simply wouldn't have enough information or capacity for a given non-player character to engage with the player characters in any way other than visible. In other words, you could walk by an NPC, you could see the NPC, but you couldn't actually interchange with them or interact with them. So having the ability to actually engage with them requires a change in the way we look at them. And the first thing to realize is that NPCs are players, are people too. Now, that doesn't mean that they are, tracked. You don't have hit points for them. You don't track well, sometimes you do, but you don't track their attributes, their advances, their backstory. Generally, you don't follow any of that. And yet, that NPC, that non-player character that the players are going to interact with, has to be a living, breathing thing to them. If you do not do this small effort and you do not give them the range of motion of a human being, if you do not allow them to interact as a person might, you take away from the very humanity of the role play you're trying to invent. And by doing so, you put yourself in danger of not having the player characters even want to engage. Because if they do not see a value, if they don't see a depth of the personalities, they're going to treat them poorly. They've done this in many sociological tests where they give you the impression that the person that you're talking about doesn't exist, even if they're in the next room. And if you do not have any way to interact with them to know that they are there, your reaction to them will be radically different than if you knew there was a human being beyond that door. And so the idea in role play, therefore, is you have to create the interconnection, the personhood of the NPC. In many basic ways, it means that you have to realize that NPCs have feelings. They do live and breathe in the moments before the personas, the characters, interact with them. They didn't just simply turn on like automata, didn't turn on like a machine to do their little song and dance and then be put back in the box. They still exist. As a matter of fact, many of your NPCs need to have some form of identity. They need to have a personality. As I mentioned in the case of Angus, they might need to have a certain dialect or way they speak to define them. These triggers that make an encounter into a NPC engagement really is talking about the NPC as a cultural mirror. The idea is that if you step into the scene and there is an NPC there and you do not see that NPC as an equal, you see them only as perhaps a part of the backdrop or a non-existent being, then you won't work to protect them. You won't work to engage with them, and the PCs are going to overtrod them. They simply are, because people interact only when they feel that there is another mind behind it. If you walk down the street and you see somebody who is acting like an imbecile, you may have compassion for them. You may even make efforts to provide something for them, but you're not engaging with them in any kind of real way because it's not someone to you. And that's really what's important, is that there are variances. We will talk about here in a little bit about how there are mechanical variances between stages or gauges of the humanity of NPCs, but it's mainly to realize that those are sliding scales, that as you move into interaction with them, they have to become more alive. They have to become more real, more tangible, more identifiable. And this paradigm does define the interaction. If you see there are no people behind you, just NPCs, you may get into a situation of a shooting match, literally damn the torpedoes and full speed ahead, because those people behind you aren't really people, they're NPCs. And while some players can make the intellectual leap and recognize their value as meaning something, there's nonetheless a radical change when they all of a sudden see those individuals as their cousins and sisters and brothers and such. And this process, therefore, makes the NPC have less intrinsic value to the PC. And I think this may affect the way our culture works on the larger scale, simply because a lot of people have got this new definition of what an NPC is, and they perceive of those that are not in agreement with them as being in that other camp, the less than category. And we really need to change that in role play in order to be able to change that in real life as well. And one of the biggest keys to this, I believe, is the experience pit trap. And what I mean by that is, in role play games, traditionally and historically, the concept of the value of an engagement was directly correlated to their combat effectiveness, and therefore mowing down civilians in a RPG session was fundamentally considered acceptable because they were only worth, a quarter of a hit point apiece. It's a quarter of an experience point apiece. And so if I whack a bunch of them, then that's going to count up. And so therefore I will try to put myself in a position of unaliving a certain number of the NPC crowd, so to speak. And this change in definition of an encounter on that basis has led to the real problems that we have. So we have to divorce the concept of experience away from persona advancement, so that a persona's advancement is not related to how many opponents they off. And that's been a problem with role-play games for a long time. As I've said before, I'm a game master who has 50 years of experience as a game master and a storyteller, and it didn't take me very long, even back in a decade or 2 decades ago, for me to realize that there has to be another way to award these advances to the players that doesn't have anything to do with how many opponents they've put in the grave, so to speak. So we definitely need to look at a change in our paradigm in order to affect real change. The next point is that we have to realize that the NPC's primary role is as population proxies. If we are going to be doing a scene that is in a congested city street, we have to have bodies in that city street interacting and passing by each other to create the necessary noise for the scene to feel real. If we describe the city street and then we don't mention any of the people on it, it will feel empty. It'll feel devoid. Even if you said it's a busy street, unless you specify literally how many bodies are crisscrossing the pathway and maybe perhaps some individuals that stand out, if you don't even do that, if all you do is put bodies on the street, you are at least creating some of the necessary noise. Now, beyond that, of course, what's really always fun, as in the case of the red-dressed woman I was mentioning from The Matrix, the idea is that you may want to have some colorful window dressing, individual set pieces of personality that walk by that have no interaction with the story other than to be definable so that you can create the visual understanding of the scene you're in. I do on occasion play games with miniatures, and I have a ton of civilians in various occupational uh, positions and such, so that I can make it look visually filled with people. But if I don't specify how many there are, what their occupations are, generally speaking, and get the player a feel for it, they nonetheless won't see them as real. And so we want to make sure we provide them that level of realism so that the players will interact with them in the right way. The idea again is that they're a proxy for NPCs. They're proxies for the large crowd of civilians in the area. Now, sometimes you can utilize the red herrings, the personnel you put on the street as red herring fodder. You can say, hey, that guy over there it looks at you funny and takes off running. Anything that you do that draws the player's attention does lead that player to make decisions perhaps differently than he would have otherwise. They're also, I hate to say it, for those players that have a penchant for thievery, the density of the population also provides a source of pocket change. Whether that be actually rogues walking down the street plying their trade of pickpocketing, or whether they are role playing as a grifter and they're trying to see who they can get involved with the game of three card Monte. The idea here is that you're providing a methodology for the players to exert their skills on a populace that by and large isn't going to be adversely reactive. And this idea is that you're giving them an opportunity to exert some of their personal identity on the scene. Another example is that you provide them outlets potentially for generosity. The idea of the poor blind woman sitting on the street corner with a cup in her hands asking for alms. The idea is that you're giving the players the opportunity to be the gracious, generous beings that we all hope that we are. But you're also providing in those scenes opportunities to test their morality. If you are a game master who really holds on to the idea of the player character as being a paladin or a priest or whatever, these ideas of having morality tests in game make a lot of sense, because you're able to then engage them with the non-player character, pardon me, so that they can, like I said, show off their generosity, maybe show their callousness. The tests that a game master might use on the players may or may not be of this moral nature. There are some people who right now are rather offended that I would even suggest such a thing. But the legacy of role-playing games included these concepts, and in many cases I wish to sort of embrace that, because I see the opportunities for role-play as an opportunity to improve not only my understanding of the game mechanics and my understanding of the world of the non-player character, but also to have a real understanding of the improvement that a human being can have, because they become more aware of the same possibilities in our realm as are in the fictional game realm. Now, when we talk about population proxies, there are a lot of different ways that they can interact, one of which is through the idea of recurring personalities. And recurring personalities are those individuals that are in the scene day after day, perhaps week after week, at least hour by hour if you're running a one-shot. These kind of individuals are going to reappear and therefore need to have deeper depth to them, because the likelihood of the players interacting with them is greatly increased when they are in the scenes more than once. So this would include the idea of workers in the area, those workers that cross the scenes, those perhaps that are regular contacts for the players. They simply show up to exchange information, and therefore there needs to be a little bit more depth to their identity. These may be persons of interest that the players have chosen and therefore are pursuing for some reason, and so therefore you want to interact with the NPC because they are simply intriguing to you. Again, the woman in the red dress comes up. Yes, you definitely find her to be a person of interest when everybody else is wearing black suits, right? But these recurring personalities may even be credible resources. Perhaps that's the person from which you get your ammunition. Perhaps that's the person that tells you where your next job is. Perhaps these are individuals who simply provide services on an ongoing basis and with which the players become familiar and therefore interact with them. And then finally, perhaps these are just simple trade and interchange personnel. The idea of the bartender, the barmaid, the innkeeper, the tavern owner. These all are personalities that need a greater amount of depth than perhaps merely the population proxies. These are the people that have a stake in the direction that the players go in and therefore are either supportive or opposed to the direction that the players want to go. Both of these are perfectly viable reasons and ways to play out an NPC and why they need to perhaps have more life to them than you might otherwise expect. And the final kind of persona that we want to talk about, besides the population proxies and the recurring personalities, are those that are story related in particular. And these can take as many varieties as you can imagine, depending on the depth and the breadth of the story that you're telling. In the case of the world of Nykos, story NPCs and recurring personalities tend to blur between one another because the players perhaps are following one story angle and not another, and therefore they run into the same person, but that person conveys two different roles. So perhaps they are the deliverer of the quest. They are the person who bring the characters the information that spawns a character decision to go and do. Perhaps they are necessary evils. You've got to shoe your horse on occasion. You have to buy some armor or weapons from time to time. Perhaps they're agents of the plot. In other words, maybe they are the informant that's already operating within the shady underworld and therefore providing information pieces to the players on an ongoing basis. Ultimately, all of these are really a form of asset or liability. When you are a persona in a game, you need people in these storied roles in order for you to function effectively in the game. And so therefore, having the concept that your encounters with Tommy the Snitch always occur on the corner of 35th and 7th, and you're very concerned with whether or not they're going to be spotted by the local authorities who have listed him as a person of interest in several crime cases because of what the players have done. That makes them either an asset, which means you provide resource to the players, or a liability, which means they are a threat to the player's livelihood. Either which way, they have to have a personality, have to have some depth. And this really, when I'm talking about how to create unforgettable characters, you have to figure out where they're going to fit in this framework and which piece of this they really have as their focus. So now we come down to how to build NPCs. And yes, I've spent most of the video talking about the very concepts of why they exist and what our purposes are. But I want to do so that you can see that there is a psychological breakdown between the population proxies that we've had to deal with and all of the other NPC types. And the major difference is that your population proxies are fundamentally window dressing. That sounds, in terms of the way people currently run NPCs, this is where most people perceive of NPCs as existing, is in that fringe space where they don't have any real value. They're not human beings. They're not someone with whom we have to be concerned. They are just part of the backdrop and the background. But in the case of the population proxies, there are, as I've mentioned in the category, a lot of different reasons for them. Perhaps they are just sheerly the blur of bodies in the background, and therefore they have no formative identity. Perhaps they are the named per NPC who walk through the scene, and so yes, you know that person's name is such and such, and that he works in such a career, but you're not involving your lives, your players' lives, with those persona. The reason why I mention them in particular is that when you build out a population proxy, you only need a few things to describe them. Therefore, you don't spend all of the energy in developing them. Because otherwise, if you think about it from a sheer standpoint, there are perhaps 5 or 6 players in your games group, and there are probably 1,000 people they have to interact with week over week, so different personalities and such. And so you don't want to have to pursue all of them to the depth that you might want to in order to flesh them out, simply because they aren't people that the players will ever interact with. And so having the madding crowd, the backdrop of bodies for population identity, is completely different. So I always recommend, in the case of those, the quickest way to build is come up with an adjective that describes it. General coloration patterns, and something about them in form of either a verb or an adverb describing what they are about. So they are quickly moving through the streets, or they are gradually meandering towards the park. There's so much power in just the use of words here that you don't have to do a large amount of identity defining in order to give those personas the depth that they need to have, because all you're needing to do is create the concept of there being that many other bodies in the scene. Now, I'm speaking completely in the meta. There are gamers who are hearing this for the first time and haven't thought about it before. But when you walk into a city of 8,000 individuals, the player personas of all of them are not going to be as fully fleshed out. That doesn't mean you don't need some basics. You need to understand, oh yes, there's this many bodies, and there are this many that are courageous, and this percentage that are armed with particular weaponry and such. Those are all minutiae things that you could add in at your leisure, but just realize that when you're building the personality matrix for them, they don't need much in the way of development. If you go from those individuals who are in the flat distance and now are walking through the scene, now you're adding more colorful description. Perhaps you're giving a description of the actual clothing that they're wearing, maybe the direction that they're walking, what they're doing with their hands, are they alone or in a group. All these kind of dynamics that you would normally see in a set piece in a motion picture need to be applied here. Give them some animation, give them some differentiation from the massive crowd behind them. But you, again, are not developing them out fully. You don't need to, because in the case of the proxies, they are simply approximating a location of an individual. Now, I'll answer there's a question being begged there, and I'm going to come back to it. But now let's talk about all of their NPCs. Whether they be story NPCs or recurring NPCs, the idea of a recurring personality showing up scene after scene, there are several things you need to develop for them. Number one is consistency. If the person that is the barber on that block happens to be a blue-haired old lady who specializes in doing beard trims, then that's who they see at that same barber shop. Every time they walk by, they need to be able to feel familiarity. If they want to have a conversation with the person sitting next to them at the bar, then that person next to them at the bar, by their very proximity, must be developed at least to some higher level. And generally, this means to build out a PC, which is go ahead and fill out a persona profile on them. Even if you only do the first page, you want to have a clear understanding of why they think what they think, perhaps some information on their species to maybe give some idea of their trends or the things they might be involved with, which therefore can feed into the game's play. If it's a story NPC, he certainly has to have more than just a simple dimension, because ultimately the players may decide he is their threat and therefore wish to engage with them. And while I don't advocate for this, there certainly is a benefit to having the players at least be able to spar with the NEPs, the non-player personas that they meet, and so for you to have at least some understanding of his basic attributes and skills. And when you are talking about building NPCs, just remember that these are PCs. They are still people. They still have depth. They still go home and wash their shoes when they get all, when they go in the house. They are as PC, as player character, as the personas, albeit not as fully developed, and perhaps you don't have their extreme list of skills. But at least you have some idea of how they might advance over time, because if you don't take that into account, then you're leaving a lot of clutter on the ground. If we go back to talk about Angus for just a minute, the idea of Angus Hereford being a guns runner was literally predicated upon the players being in a place where they found some rather powerful weapons and assumed that somebody nearby was manufacturing them. I hadn't fully developed that concept, but I did have this smith in the area whose name was Angus Hereford, and that was my original depth of him, was merely that he was a blacksmith. When they went to check on him in order to give him distinction, I made him Tarmakian, Minotaur, and I gave him a southern drawl. Well, pretty soon they're equating him to a Wild West character, which gave him the John Chisholm look, and then from that I added the clarifications that Lady Lily doesn't like him coming in the house with his horns scratching up her beautiful wallpaper, so therefore he added the corks to be conscientious of that. Well, these little nuances, these little things that made sense from a persona standpoint, therefore conveyed to the players a more likable, more realistic, and more believable NPC. Well, to this day, the Hereford Corporation, the Hereford organization, is supplying weaponry to majority mercenary forces around the globe of Nykos. His name is known, his culture is known. Perhaps he himself has long since passed, but his descendants still hail to this concept of the good-natured southern boy who is going to be trading and building weaponry for the PCs and their allies going forward. And this creates, therefore, a lovable NPC that they really can't get enough of. And the challenge really is that if you are running a campaign and you haven't built out any NPCs in this fashion, consider at least building one, someone who's local to the party, who they see on a regular basis, and play through that. Get used to, familiar with the idea of building out a complete persona for your NPCs. Because when you do that, when you breathe life into them, then they bring life to your game. I really appreciate you being here with me for this episode. We're a little bit over my regular time frame, but I want to thank you, and we will see you in the next episode. Remember, if you haven't yet, subscribe here on Twitch, because if you're a subscriber, you don't get commercials and you get to watch through the entire episode unbroken. And on the other hand, if you haven't yet followed the channel, make sure you do that so you'll know every time we do a new update. Also, go over to NycosRPG on YouTube, so at NycosRPG on YouTube, and check out the various channels. The Game Master's Toolbox is there, as well as the Game Master's Soapbox, as well as Around the World and the World in Around 80 Days, and so on. All these different shows predicated to help you become a better game master and to engage your players in ways that make them truly love coming to play at your table. Till the next time, I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been NycosRPG. We'll see you next time.